You are listening to the Addiction Files, where we discuss evidence-based treatment, clinical pearls, and resources while striving to destigmatize the treatment of addiction in our medical culture and save lives. We are the Addiction Doctors, Dr. Darlene Petersen and Paula Cook. Welcome to the Addiction Files. We are thrilled. We have Christine Minhee joining us. And this is an episode that we are really excited about. We are talking about the opioid settlement funds. And so I'm going to turn it over to Paula, who's going to introduce Christine to us, and then we'll get started.
Great. So we have Christine Minhee with us. JD is the founder of opioidsettlementtracker.com. She tracks U.S. state and local governments' opioid settlements reached, opioid settlement decision-making processes, opioid settlement expenditure reports, and opioid settlement grant-making to communities. Christine launched her website in 2019 after graduating from the University of Washington School of Law, where she co-authored The Cure for America's Opioid Crisis, End the War on Drugs, which was published in Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy. She is an Opioid Industry Documents Archive National Advisory Committee member, has held visiting scholar appointments at UW Law and Yale Law School, and has been featured by the Associated Press, CBS News, Fast Company, Freakonomics Radio, Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, which was very good, by the way, the New York Times, NPR, Reuters, and the Washington Post. She holds a BA in English from Stanford University and is a graduate of the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism's Columbia Publishing course. Thank you for joining us, Christine.
Thank you so much for having me.
So first, Christine, I just want to know what got you interested in this opioid settlement money in the first place?
So I have always been interested in drug law and drug policy, and I went to law school hoping to do something related. And frankly, I thought I would be involved in cannabis law, but at least in the state of Washington, what I've learned is that cannabis law is effectively small to medium-sized business law, because in legal states, it's about, regulatory compliance and the like. And I found more of the front-end advocacy a little bit more interesting. So a professor of mine asked me to write, co-author with him, an article about the opioid litigation, which had just been starting up at the time. And at the time being like 2018 was when this article began, I suppose. But he wanted to write about the role of pill mills and doctors, or so-called pill mills, and the role of doctors in fueling our overdose crisis. And my interest wasn't there. I said, hey, let me take a second look. And I read everything I could about not just the opioid litigation, but the history of public health litigation, which of course includes the big tobacco litigation, which we can also talk about. But after kind of just inhaling, what the world, it felt like, my ire kind of went towards the regulatory agencies, right? Like we have federal agencies tasked to literally protect the health and wellness of its people. And we have a lot of collusion, I suppose, or alleged collusion between folks who work in these federal agencies and the pharmaceutical companies themselves. Primarily around the issue of suspicious order flagging monitoring. But anyway, my interest turned to the regulatory agencies. And then I just kept my interest up. I just found the whole thing so fascinating, because you can't really think about the opioid litigation or the opioid settlements and how they should be spent in a vacuum. If you're thinking about it right, you have to think about it within the context of the war on drugs. You have to think about it within the context of our healthcare industry and its like gargantuan, massive problems. I mean, like Warren Buffett refers to the American healthcare industry as a tapeworm, right? So I just found the opioid litigation, for me, the most fascinating entree into all of these big issue concerns I think I've always had in my life. And also it tied in my personal interest into addiction spending as well. I, like millions of Americans, have personal experience with loving someone experiencing addiction and addiction within my family. And what you learn from that process is that loving someone who is experiencing addiction is kind of a meditation in you not giving up hope, but also it's a meditation on intent, so to speak. Like if you want to, if you love someone who is addicted and you want them to live a healthier or what could ultimately just be a normative definition of a better life in your view, like what is the fine line between coercing them and pressuring them and helping and loving and supporting their agency, right? And I think the space is just it's filled with so much emotional nuance as well, because, yeah, we might, when we talk about the opioid litigation, we're talking about like billions of dollars being transferred between pharmaceutical companies and state and local governments. And there's this assumption that these monies will fall like manna from heaven, so to speak, and enrich the communities. But in order to have these monies actually enrich communities, it's actually like a painful, hugely, labyrinthian process of advocacy, which is hugely state by state. And we can talk about that as well. And it isn't necessarily true. And I think COVID kind of called this out for the average American. It isn't necessarily true that just because you give a state government a bunch of resources, that those resources will necessarily end up in the communities that need them most, right? Like in the COVID example, like just because you ship a bunch of hospital ventilators to state, like doesn't mean the most impacted areas will get them the quickest or whatnot. So kind of, we know this in healthcare, right? That healthcare and equitable healthcare and effective healthcare is really about kind of last mile delivery, so to speak, and that whole process to get the monies to the folks who need it most and the communities that need it most. It requires a type of attention and love that I think is kind of it's kind of like the meta experience of like what it means to love someone who's experiencing addiction. It's everything's a fractal, right? Like not to get too meta about everything, but it feels similar to me. And I think one can fairly say that America has kind of an intent problem. Like, we look at the effect of our healthcare infrastructure and our substance use disorder treatment facilities and the programming and the disparate impact upon certain communities over others. And you just look at pure success rates of some of these programs, and you can kind of get a sense that, you have to stay on the details until the very end of delivery for things to be successful. But, that also, it's a very like nuanced political process. And that interested me as well, because America is, it hasn't moved past completely its war on drugs history, and it rears its head in very obvious and also very nuanced ways within opioid settlements. So like opioid settlements is this like perfect petri dish by which we can kind of examine and confront some of the biggest issues that we see with our healthcare industry overall, I think, and with American politics overall, because so much of addiction spending and getting monies to be spent on certain things versus others is very third rail and political too, right? So all of that I found. So I continue to find super fascinating. That was a long ramble, and I can continue, but I won't threaten you with a good time. But it's a lot, all packed into one kind of case study. And I just find it endlessly fascinating.
I love it. You say that so well. And touch on a little bit. So this history behind why it's so important that we get this opioid settlement distribution right. So going back to the tobacco settlement, because we keep comparing it to that and where we went horribly wrong. So kind of compare that a little bit of why that is such an issue.
Sure. And this was like a particular focus of nerding out for me when I was in law school. Not that I had the free time, but I just, on my off hours, when you Wikipedia dive, I suppose. It started with Wikipedia diving, my interest in the big tobacco litigation, which, just to kind of give the short explainer of what it is, the big tobacco litigation occurred in the 90s between state attorneys general, so the the head attorneys for the states, and the four biggest tobacco manufacturers at the time, which concluded Philip Morris et al., right? So Marlboro Man, et cetera. And what this litigation between plaintiffs being states attorneys and the defendants being the four biggest tobacco manufacturers, it resulted in what lawyers called the MSA, which is the Master Settlement Agreement. And that was reached that was finalized depending on what you consider finalization in the legal sense, either in 1998 or 1999. And depending on the valuation you're using, it's either 246 or 248 kind of ish $1 billion settlement accord between 46 states attorneys generals and four of the biggest tobacco manufacturers. And it resulted in a lot of money, like $250 billion is a lot. And what ended up happening with this money is ultimately what makes big tobacco still on the top of public health researchers' minds today. It became a national embarrassment, frankly. It's somewhat of a well-documented point that these monies weren't spent on the reasons why the states ostensibly went to sue these companies in the first place, right? Because the states attorneys generals, when they were formulating their arguments and, coming up with the pleadings and the case as a whole against these manufacturers, it's, you've killed off so many of our people that you owe us money because we've been bleeding chips cleaning up the mess that you've created, is the kind of summary of the litigation from the id, so to speak, right? So the one could kind of safely assume, just, as a member of the general public, that these monies, if they're, pursued for this reason, that they should be spent in a way that's tethered to that reason, right? And that's, a solid, safe, general kind of moral balance assumption one could make. And also from a legal technical perspective, it is safe to make that assumption as well. Like, these monies are, especially within what's called parens patriae doctrine, which is a doctrine within the law that allows, state and local governments, as one example, to go out. Well, it's mostly state governments if you're getting like a purist about the doctrine, but it allows state governments to go out and sue entities on behalf of the health and wellness of its citizens. So if you look at the legal doctrines they're using, like, it's also a safe assumption from immersing yourself in that these monies should be spent on something related to tobacco treatment and prevention, right? But I think it's the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids that publishes its paradigmatic, I think, annual report. And they make the point that less than 3% of the big tobacco monies have been spent on the right things, like the right things. So that's mortifying. Like, that's mortifying.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's just crazy. 3%.
Yeah, it's rough. It's really rough. And it's just, there are some like big tobacco like geeks, and I don't want to like bore them by mentioning this point because it's kind of one of those like common horror stories for them. But like, the most horrific example of big tobacco's money, not horrific, it's not the most horrific, it's just the most on the nose, ha, but in a sad dystopic way example. It would be North Carolina using its big tobacco monies as subsidies for tobacco farmers, right? So, we have this history, not, I would say a history, because it's not just big tobacco. The history of public health settlement spending in this country is its own like podcast episode, but we have a very large, obvious, embarrassing example of states suing corporations for public health monies that they don't then spend on public health. So that's the kind of emotional backdrop of the opioid litigation. And we come into the opioid litigation, and now, if you read the settlement agreements, depending on the settlement, it's safe to say that at least 85% of any one settlement agreement has to be spent on what's called opioid remediation, which is the legal term to describe the right things. And that provision that exists in the settlement agreements, and the list of settlements is on my website, opioidsettlementtracker.com/global settlement tracker. But each of these settlements have provisions that describe like minimum percentage thresholds. I mentioned 85. That's kind of like the lowest one amongst like the relevant settlements that we're talking about today. But opioid remediation is a broad term. We can talk about what's a document called Exhibit E here in a bit if you'd like, but opioid remediation is basically a term used to encompass all the things that the general public would assume opioid settlements should be spent on, given the fact that they were earned or like retained or transferred to the states on the basis of the fact that so many people have been hurt and have died thus far, right? So I think big tobacco is kind of an embarrassing emotional backdrop to the opioid litigation. And I would say, as someone who entered this space being very cynical, not cynical in not cynical in an abrasive way. I think I was very, by the time I graduated from law school, I was very well versed in the history of the big tobacco litigation and the terms of the master settlement agreement. And I knew we were careening into a very similar situation with the opioid litigation, right? And my take was, these monies, if history is going to repeat itself, these monies will probably be spent poorly. I think as someone who understands the governing legal text and someone who is just kind of, personally and professionally kind of neurotically obsessed with like accountability and, issues of that ilk, just millennial advocate over here. I thought that a good lane for me to take in this war on drugs debate, so to speak, would be the watchdog lane. My assumption is that if history will repeat itself, that opioid settlements will be spent poorly. So I'm just going to sit there and watch. I'm going to watch all the settlements being reached. I'm going to watch the states come up with their plans for spend. I'm going to watch how they're reporting their expenditures. By the way, each of these categories, there are data sets that on my website that correspond to each. But I just wanted to create a record of what the heck was going on, right? Like if there's a big pot of money that's inevitably going to be misspent because America is going to America, that's a negative assumption. But if that's the case, then how big is that pot and how quickly does it shrink? Who gets to control its purse strings? Like I want to document all of that. So that was my kind of vibe that I took away from the big tobacco litigation. I'm like, okay, like this doesn't really look good for us. So I'm just going to watch, right? And just spoiler alert is that was my perspective in 2019, and it's 2024 now. And I can't believe I've been doing this for so long. But, now that I've been doing it for a number of years, like half a decade, like why? Like that's crazy to me. But now that I've been doing this for a number of years, and those years include every week reading every single Google alert containing the words opioid and settlement, which I still do. Now that I've been doing that for a while, what I can say is that my cynicism has shrunk a little bit. It has not gone away, obviously, but the fears that people had from the big tobacco era of things were that, one, that the monies just wouldn't, that only 3% of it would be spent well, right? That the monies just wouldn't, and not enough of it would be spent on the right things. And that even if there was good spending would drop off after a number of years, or that it wouldn't be required for all the years, which is to say nothing of like public input into the decision-making processes. But like from the lawyer's perspective, actually, like those are the two biggest things. It's, that the fear and the expectation that without a minimum abatement percentage, that these monies would be spent terribly, and that states, even if they make a good show of spending things well, 1 year, that they're not required to do that for the rest of the terms. If we're going to narrowly define the big tobacco nightmare, so to speak, to just mean those two things, then I would say that the opioid settlements have prevented that nightmare from happening. The opioid settlements, from my view, as a formerly cynical advocate in this space and someone who has, a vested interest and skin in the game with all things war on drugs, what I'll say is that the settlement agreements do seem quite responsive to the history of big tobacco. Like it looks like the settlement agreements were written by a collective consciousness that said, all right, like the obvious mistakes we made with big tobacco, let's try to not make those obvious mistakes, right? So we're going to require a minimum to be spent on the right things. We're going to define kind of broadly and leave the politics of the war on drugs up to the states, as they always have been. We're going to define opioid remediation broadly, but we're going to empower the states to decide for themselves how to meet these minimum thresholds, these minimum requirements of abatement, according to whatever state processes and political instincts already exist. But
can you like go into what they mean with these abatement funds? Because isn't that one of the key things that's different with the big tobacco settlement is the way the money is allocated to the states? Is that correct?
I wouldn't say that it's necessarily. There are certainly huge variations in the distribution and allocation of funds between the big tobacco administration phase of things and now, and that's a fact. But what I would say is that the biggest difference is in the required nature of spend. So you were speaking about abatement funds, and I'll say this is kind of a cheat code, but abatement and opioid remediation are used interchangeably.
Okay.
Most contexts within opioid settlement discussions, at least. Abatement, this idea that, these settlement monies should be spent to abate or prevent or push back or generally build, like make sure it doesn't happen again. The idea that these settlement money should be spent to abate future opioid or future overdose crises, that's actually like specifically written into the settlement agreements. It's a term. There are specific terms that describe states' responsibilities to spend at least, we talked about the minimum percentages earlier, but states' responsibilities to spend 85% in most cases, 85% on opioid remediation, which is effectively abatement, right? Like opioid remediation abatement, and in the opioid settlement context, like the simplest way I could describe it is that regardless of where the money sits and who decides the spend, the settlement agreements are complied with if that minimum abatement thing is reached.
Okay.
So you can put it in the general fund and require the legislature via statute to spend it only on abatement. That's how you can kind of cabin it. And
Okay.
but that's one way that both the general fund and good abatement can exist in the same world.
Great. Thank you for clarifying that.
Christine, could you go back a few steps and there may be some listeners who don't understand how much money was allocated for opioid settlement monies and when this all occurred. I mean, I think most of our listeners are obviously familiar with the opioid epidemic and the various waves, but just a very brief history of how we got these monies in the first place and how long we were expected to get settlement funds allocated to each of the states.
Sure. So the first few settlement agreements were reached and started being paid out 2021, 2022. And I'm mentioning both dates because when a settlement is reached and when the state, kind of gets its ducklings in order, the ducklings being the local governments to also sign on to the settlement agreements. And when the states get the monies, that's kind of a timeline in its own process. But it's fair to say that states first started receiving their monies in earnest in 2022. The opioid litigation at large kind of got started, of course, a number of years prior. And when I launched my settlement tracking project by 2019, there was enough litigation at play for me to be able to launch a website and say, this is the stuff that's happening, right? So in 2019, the litigation was in earnest. And in 2022, the states started receiving their monies first, and the ones with infrastructure prepared to receive and spend these monies, however they're spending it. Some of the states started spending their monies in 2022, but 2023 was the first real full year of spend in the minds of both advocates and the decision makers. So that is kind of the timeline. And 2024, now that we're depending on when you're counting and which settlement. We're about 3 years into settlement spending. So we have right now where we're at is a kind of sweet spot where we have enough information from the states and we have a few years of spend under their belts to kind of get a sense of how they're planning to continue spending the monies over time. And over time being for the duration of these settlement payouts, which depending on the settlement, right? The longest payout period is 18 years, and the shortest I think I've seen has been like 1 year. Sometimes it's just a lump sum payment, and that those go for like the smaller settlements. But the biggest settlement on the table is, and this is just one settlement of many that makes up this whole total of opioid settlements that I track on my website. But the biggest settlement that's already being paid out, so it's no longer on the table. It's being spent. That's $21 billion, and that's with the opioid distributors and the big three opioid distributors. And that's an 18-year payout term. Whereas some of the smaller settlements that we've seen more recently, some with, the marketing consulting-esque companies, some of those settlements are smaller, so they can just be paid out in a lump sum in 1 year. But in general, when I look at states' planning materials and how they're kind of thinking about doling out the monies over time, their timelines end around like 2035. That would be the 18-year mark from what is 2035 minus 18. Like that's when they started receiving that biggest chunk of monies. Hopefully the math makes it such that it's 2022 when they started receiving it, because that would be correct. But yeah, we have about 18 years of spend. We're 3 years into it. We have enough to kind of judge where things are headed. And we also, this is where the sweet spot aspect comes into it. We are also in a position where we can change the course of spending for certain states and localities, depending on the way things are set up.
So going back to how things are set up, can you go into what is Exhibit E?
Sure. So Exhibit E is a 15-page document that's attached to all of the major settlement agreements. And it's a 15-page document that describes a list of opioid remediation uses. And the document is, the simplest way to describe it is that it's the way the settlement agreements elaborate on what opioid remediation is or could be. So Exhibit E is a document that contains approved uses of settlement monies, and it's divided into various different topical sections. I mean, the overall division of the document is core strategies and approved uses, but from the perspective of actual treatment and prevention, and folks who would be interested in the actual abatement aspect of things. I mean, the categories are numerous. They're support for criminal justice involved persons. There's a separate harm reduction section. They're like OUD treatment as broken out from prevention, broken out from education and research. And so if folks are interested in seeing what, these documents are written by human beings, right? So if I want to get really specific here, like if folks are interested in seeing what particular experts would define as opioid remediation circa, somewhere between 2016 and 2019, that would be a good document to look at. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that Exhibit E is described as non-exhaustive by the settlement agreements itself. And what that means is that it's just a vibe. Like states can, they're required to spend their monies on opioid remediation, right? A large percentage of their monies on opioid remediation. But that opioid remediation is a very broad definition in the settlement agreements, and it's anything kind of designed to treat or prevent or somewhat related to OUD and co-occurring SUD and mental health conditions. So it's opioid remediation is deliberately defined broadly within the settlement agreements. Where Exhibit E comes into that is that in the technical definition of opioid remediation within the agreements, Exhibit E is referred to as a non-exhaustive list of uses that constitute approved purposes according to the settlement agreements. So, of course, that that begs a million questions, right? Like, how states prioritize what to spend? Have they been spending outside of Exhibit E? What have states mostly been spending it on? Is this fear that law enforcement spend takes up most of it? Is that true? Fighting opioid remediation. And Exhibit E is an example list of its breadth.
How are states using the money, and what is the process? Because personally, I was witness to this process in 2023 up close for a small rural allocation, and I was actually shocked and angry at the process. So I'm just wondering your Gestalt view of how it's going, especially I'm happy to see that you're less cynical. I came into this conversation like just mad. I'm just angry, but I'm glad. This is good. This is calming me down a bit. I'm interested to hear how you think things are going and why you think things are going well and how we could do better.
Yes. Thank you for the opportunity to talk on that. And the thing I wanted to mention earlier, and like my interruption kind of energy, the thing I wanted to mention was that, you're right that even OUD and SUD are just defined broadly in opioid settlement spending discussions at large. But what has been profoundly interesting to me is that certain states have taken the view that opioid settlement monies should be spent on anything overdose related, whereas other states have narrowed the requirements of the settlement agreements, right? Because how I said that the definition of opioid remediation plus Exhibit E, the vibe is like, as long as it's overdose crisis related, that's abatement. But states can, of course, be more restrictive than that, provided that, the money, that abatement threshold is still being met. They can be more restrictive. So I want to give it very specific examples. In California, you see headlines, especially from San Francisco, about the city's opioid settlement distributions being spent on issues related to cocaine and meth, because it's not a newsflash, we're in a polysubstance crisis, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas in Idaho, the Attorney General's office has come out with an opinion that describes that opioid settlements can only be spent on OUD related things. And in fact, in order to spend, you have to certify that OUD is the kind of crux and nexus of the nature of spend, because apparently in Idaho, there isn't a polysubstance crisis. We should be taking a look at what's, different there epidemiologically, and just, what is happening, right? Because if you look at the ways that some of the states are articulating what these monies can be spent on, you can kind of get a sense of how they might have been treating war on drugs related things up until that point. Because my final ramble about the settlement agreements, I suppose, would be that the agreements kind of punt the politics of abatement to the states. And it does a brilliant job of setting things up so that the pharmaceutical companies can get their tax break. And there's that is a fact. The pharma companies are getting a tax break for these settlements, provided they're spent on abatement, right? But the settlement agreements do a fantastic job of making sure that that's satisfied and then getting out of the way of state politics. So you see California on one hand and Idaho on the other, just on the issue of whether or not these money should be spent in a polysubstance or an OUD specific way. Even on that issue, you see a bunch of divergence. So on the topic of how these monies are spent, and I want to couch what I'm about to say in what are our shared cynicism, because the cynical gal within me hasn't gone away. There's next to her has, I don't know, the more hopeful person has become more vocal or has become braver, or I don't really know how does it work in the interfamily systems model of things. But as a whole, I would say that there's a lot of freaking out about how settlements are being spent. So this is kind of a meta approach. I think that there's a lot of chicken littling about just freaking out, the sky is falling about how these monies are being spent based off of what ultimately could be one or two isolated reports. I mentioned at the outset that I still read every single Google alert containing the words opioid and settlement. And I've been doing that since 2019. So I have a very good sense of how the media zeitgeist has moved and shifted over time, and how frankly, like little things like the emotional format of an article. Like it used to be quite predictable. It's like, here, hundreds of thousands of Americans that, have died from blah, 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 and is impacted. And then you can almost like predict the emotional template of some of these articles. But anyway, I have a sense of what people have been freaking out about for the last 5-6 years. And this last 2 years, it's been a lot of harm reduction versus law enforcement discussion, right? Like, should opioid settlement monies be spent on community advocates that advocate for drug spectrometers and hand out syringes, right? Clean syringes. Or should opioid settlement money should be spent on Deterra and Bola Wrap, which is like, so that debate has been large and colorful and has taken up a lot of the emotional space in the room, I suppose. But what I've noticed, and this is someone who tracks states' reporting of their own expenditures. So if there's any place on the internet where a state or locality is publishing its spend and saying, X number of dollars went to this, I track that, and it's all available. All of those advisory committee reports, the annual reports, the dashboards, I've collected all those. It's in my expenditure report tracker. But what I've learned from doing the tracking of the reports itself is that I think that the 80-20 rule kind of generally applies nationally, which is that the 80% of so in this bell curve representing opioid settlement spend and how monies have been spent thus far, by the 80-20 rule, what I mean is that 80% in the middle, where, the bulk of monies, I think it's being spent on kind of just what you'd expect. Like it's being spent on naloxone. It's being spent on improving treatment infrastructure within the state. It's being spent on grants to community orgs. It's the unsexy headlines. Like I think the 80% is being spent there. And what I've noticed is that the reporting is, this is not expressive of the outlets, the editorial. This is not a criticism because so much of opioid settlement advocacy rests upon the reporters and the journalists who are interested in this and the outlets who are interested in what advocates are saying. So in no way, shape, or form am I like critiquing their selection process of pieces. But because these outlets are businesses too, you can't just write about boring things all the time. Like that's what state reporting is for, right? Like that's what state dashboards are for. It's like, yeah, we spent on naloxone. It's like, yeah, we would have expected that. But the media outlets have to report on the things that are timely and interesting and clickable. And I think that that's the bottom and top 10%, which right now is kind of law enforcement and harm reduction. So I'm not attaching percentages to spend, but I would say that over time, I have adopted that view, which is that I think the bulk of the monies are kind of being spent on perhaps unimpressive, but still technically abatement related things. And then the really third rail stuff, like if you look at the way to quantify whether or not there's like a huge percentage of bad spend within a state, I guess, would be frankly to look at the decision makers, I suppose. And that's kind of a hot tip that I would mention to people. It's like, yes, and the decision makers and their spending rules, which that's been my most recent focus of study. I've partnered with an organization called Vital Strategies. Last year, we released these community guides that basically are the encyclopedia of every state and local spending rule that we could come across. So if you're interested in how monies are being spent in Utah, right? Like, for example, you would go to this community guide that we've written for Utah, just PDF, where we've summarized everything the state has said about its opioid settlement planning. So who's going to decide the monies? Where is it going to sit? What can it be spent on? Is it Exhibit E or is it a subset of Exhibit E? Familiarizing oneself with the spending rules and the things that the decision makers are required to do or legally required to do until the monies run out. I think that's a great way to get a handle of how the monies are being spent, which is to say nothing of like looking at, a state's reporting dashboard and kind of sussing out for yourself. But I think that I wanted to kind of couch my answer in a way that talked to the cynicism. I think that's why it has shifted for me. It's not that bad spend isn't a problem. It's that for me, I see the distribution in my head is a little different. Like I think that what I was told growing up when I was more of a frustrated person about the world, I suppose, and what I would hear often is, most people are just good people trying to do a good job. And that kind of goes for government too. Yes, we might have, federal executive issues at the moment, but generally folks, most people are just generally trying to do a good job. And I have found that maxim, however hackneyed or however trite, like I have found that's come more and more to my mind, both as I've liaised with the state and local decision makers themselves and as I've looked at their spend. I'm like, yeah, it's kind of, most people are just trying to do good. But there, of course, like the outliers, right? Like we can name West Virginia is giving a fair, both the the localities, local spend in West Virginia, a lot of the monies are going to law enforcement. That I see a lot of that reporting happening, both from media and like the local government, like agenda packets themselves. In Louisiana, a well-circulated point is that 20% of the monies are allocated to sheriffs, right? Like sheriffs, it's understatement of the year, but I don't think sheriffs are historically known for providing equity-based harm reduction services or things that are going to move the needle on population health, like as a matter of first priority, right? So, yeah, I think there are of course outliers to like my general sentiment that the monies are not being spent in a nightmare fashion all the time. But there's like a ballast and a kind of like inertia that I believe in now that like most of it is just kind of, it's legally required to spend on abatement. So we can kind of expect like most of it, we might not be happy with all of it, but that most of it's going to kind of just might be like, It's like one of that meme, it ain't work, but, or what is that? Do you know what meme I'm talking about? Where it's just like, it ain't honest work, but it's work, like one of those kinds of things. Anyway.
Okay, I'll try to not do too many more cynical questions, but I just have one that when you're talking about the spending from state to state, and this kept coming up on some of the news feeds, how many is, I don't even know if you can even track this, but you hear about New York, for example, that some states actually would decrease the amount that they were already devoting in their normal funds to opioid use disorder because they were anticipating the release of these funds. Is this just blown out of proportion, or is this something that's really happening?
No, it's not. It's not. You're dead correct to be worried about that. And I just feel like it's hilarious you're asking about that now because it's like, yeah, like things are not that bad, guys. And then you mentioned the one big tobacco nightmare that is most likely to repeat itself.
Like we'll just defund everything. Like
and that the practice you're describing where like opioid settlement in expectation of how many millions of dollars of opioid settlements coming in, that states will kind of take their foot off the gas, so to speak, on spending for SUD priorities, for instance. So that's referred to as supplantation, which is the antonym of supplementing monies, right? Like expanding infrastructure. It's like
basically, yeah.
Yeah. So it's, it's Parasite. And a friend of mine and a colleague on the Vital Strategies Project, Kate Bolton, refers to it as a shell game. And I think that that's quite accurate. It's the practice of using new monies to kind of replace baseline spending that should have been there and should be maintained in the first place.
Yes.
That was a huge issue in big tobacco. And in fact, I just love the timing of your ask because what I usually when I give presentations, I do the whole like, oh, things are not that bad. And then I hit him with like but there's supplementation. That's exactly what this is, which is it's the big tobacco nightmare that is most likely to repeat itself with the opioid settlements. And it's because it's the only big spending process related nightmare that doesn't have a protection in the opioid settlement agreement.
Okay.
There is no
the loophole. That's the open loophole.
It is the
that could still
loophole.
be there.
And in fact, can I just say this? And I will say that the folks of SAMHSA are quite nice, and they've been informed, and I've presented to SAMHSA Region 5, and alongside a colleague of mine, Mary Pounder from the Comer Family Foundation. And so I have a lot of respect for their work. However, they came out with a braided funding document that talks about, how to spend opioid settlement monies, kind of in tandem with SOAR grants, to achieve, statewide abatement related goals or whatnot. Anyway, within this braided funding document, there's a section where they talk about opioid settlements, and there's a passage that states that key provisions in the settlement agreements protect against the supplantive uses of settlement funds. That is dead wrong. That's not true at all. And they know I've been informed. The channels have been channeling, but it's a fact. The settlement agreements just kind of have been like, supplantation. What? I'm just kind of like, what do you mean supplantation? Because it's kind of the thing that I think would have, excuse my colloquialism, but it would have pissed off the state parties the most. It's just like, what do you mean? Like all of it has, how do we even track that? Like just the compliance alone would be so burdensome so as to inspire objection, I think. But that is a huge issue in the opioid settlement context. And what I will say is that we have some data coming out. Vital Strategies and I are coming out with an update to the community guides, and it's hugely expanded. Like our last year's guides exist in PDF form, which is great. Like PDFs are accessible, that's fine. But we wanted to provide the world of detail we had for each state within their own individual web pages. So we have individual web pages for the states that describe all of their spending rules. And not only that, what is and is not required for community advocates as well. So it's not only what do the settlement decision makers, what do they have to spend it on and how and with whom, not just that, but community advocates, are there inroads for public input? Does lived experience have a required seat at the decision-making table? Our guides have consumed the universe of legally binding materials related to those topics, because Vital Strategies and I are aligned on the fact that because these settlement monies, which we haven't even talked about this, but by my last estimation, just 1% to 2% of these monies are going to individuals directly. The grand majority of it is going to governments on the good faith that they'll spend it for us, right? Spend it on us. But these guides get into the kind of accessibility of settlement funds to community advocates off of our shared conviction that these monies, because so much of it was won on the backs of hundreds of thousands of people dying, and so much of it thus ought to be spent well. Like, we believe in the wisdom of community advocates, and we believe in the wisdom of including those who have actually experienced addiction at the decision-making table. So we created this resource to literally provide every inroad imaginable. If it exists, if there's public comments at a particular meeting, if there's a survey link that we found, it's in there. So that's the resource that we're launching here in just a few weeks. That gets into whether or not states are required to spend these monies in a way that expands infrastructure. Stated conversely, it gets into whether or not the states are prohibited from spending these monies in ways that supplant existing funding for particular causes. So New York, you had mentioned as a good example. Of course, the governor had proposed to supplant some I think it was $162 million.
Something like that. Yeah.
Some quite large amount, which the shocking part about all of this is the fact that there's a specific New York, I had mentioned that the settlement agreements don't prohibit supplantation, that it, by implication, kind of looks away and technically permits it. That doesn't mean that states can't then volunteer in a somewhat goody two shoes fashion, like, no, we're not going to supplant, we're going to go out of our way to enact a statute to say we're not going to spend these monies in a way that will supplant other resources. New York is a state that has done this, and the statute only pertains to, I think it's just 39% of the monies, or 36.39% of the monies, because that's the monies that that belong to the opioid settlement fund and that the advisory board is attached to. That's another kind of little known fact about New York, which is that the majority of the monies are being spent by localities and not the board. But anyway, in New York actually, the legislature actually went out of its way to enact a statute that said monies in the opioid settlement fund will not be used to supplant existing resource and will only be used to supplement whatever. That's like the best case scenario as like a legal advocate. It's just like, thank goodness, it's not in the settlement agreements, but they went out of their way to do it. And yet, we get the governor like, what statute, like proposing to supplant, and it is an active risk. So thank you for mentioning the New York case study. That in of itself is kind of like, hello, like, this is possible even with the statute. But what I can say is that Vital Strategies and I have gone through and have actually calculated what percent of funds allocated nationally is at risk for supplantation. And I can say that it's the majority. I'm not going to give a percentage until the resource is out. It'll be out, and hopefully it'll be a percentage that, not hopefully a percentage that will be as shocking, because we don't want to be shocked by this percentage, but inevitably I found it to be a shocking percentage. It is the percent of funds nationally in the hands of state and local governments from opioid settlements that can be used to replace existing funding that should have been there is enormous. It's billions of dollars. So that is a huge problem.
But this is what we need to know, because this is a big area of advocacy that each of us need to do at our state and local levels to try to protect these funds. That's why we need to know this information. That's great.
I think it's been a fascinating conversation, and it just, from a practical level, what can organization or small grassroots organizations do to get some of these funds? Because much like grant writing, once you get grants, you're more likely to get grants, and you have to have grant writers, and you have to have the resources to and the know-how to get these kinds of funds. And, we all know people and organizations who really would benefit from these monies because they work directly with families and people who are most vulnerable or who have lost people to opioid use disorder. So how can we practically direct people to benefit from this money, especially since it's going to be a windfall for the next decade plus 8 years for some of the money?
Yeah. So I've created a resource that is directly on point to what you're talking about. In the benefit of my role, I get to partner with the organizations whose work I've respected a lot as a law student. So, the Legal Action Center in this case, and I have partnered to create what's called a community grant track, or I should back up. On opioidsettlementtracker.com, there is a tab, Community Grant Tracker. If you go there, you'll find what I'm talking about now, which is a product that I created with the Legal Action Center that tallies all of the it collects all of the opioid settlement funded grant portals and RFPs and requests for applications and all of the grant-related opportunities that are funded by opioid settlements that I've come across my weekly tracking. It's all on this page. This page, the Community Grant Tracker page, so it's opioidsettlementtracker.com/community grant tracker. It has a number of things on it, but I would say that there are two main features of that resource, I suppose. One would be the actual map I created, the map and spreadsheet I created with the Legal Action Center, which tracks opioid settlement funded grant opportunities, not just for the states. The map just does the states, but if you get into the spreadsheet that immediately follows, I track opioid settlement funded grant opportunities for localities as well. The map and spreadsheet, though, I kind of treat as a collection of everything that I've seen. I'm just going to throw it in there. And it doesn't speak to whether or not there are particular application deadlines coming up, or whether or not those opportunities are live right now, or if they're just examples of the ways that localities or states have doled out money in the past. The other feature of my community grant tracker page is what's called the notable live opportunities section. There is where I more or less dump all of the opioid settlement RFPs and RFAs that I come across in my my Google Alerts tracking, which is broad because it's just the word opioid and settlement as keywords, right? So I kind of catch it all. Just not a Pokemon reference, but the live opportunities I put within that section attached to deadlines. But I want to talk. So that's kind of my technical response that I'd like to
Thank
say
you.
to your question. But if I can address the more heart element, which is the fact that, there are organizations out there that are well financed and have a grants writer and grants coordinator on staff, and they have a history with the state, and perhaps they are already a procurement vendor, and perhaps so there are the entities on that end of the spectrum. And then there are the entities that I created this resource for, which are the community organizations who, the person who might be organizing food drives might be the one completing the grant application, right? Like the organizations that might shut down if they don't get 15K in Q3 or whatever. Those are the organizations that this resource is for. I'd like to be very explicit. Like the Legal Action Center and I launched this resource on Juneteenth for a very obvious, purpose, with the fullness of our selection of that date. My whole vibe as a whole with my work and my kind of MO with law school is to Robin Hood what I've learned for my people, right? I do not want these opportunities to be gated or veiled by, newsletter subscriptions from for-profit organizations, or, I don't want them only to be circulated to advisory committee email lists, which you might not even know about, unless you're already privileged enough to know that there is an advisory committee involved. And, so it goes on. And access is like one of those, you're doing it right if you're always worrying about it. And you're ensuring, I think the way to fight for access to resources, which is to say nothing of the right access to health and the right to health, which of course is encoded in various like UN principles, global health, fine, right? In America, a little touch and go, but access is a huge component of this. When I launched this project with the Legal Action Center, I was very clear about the fact that this is not the one. Folks with grant writers on staff, forgive me for the reference, need not apply. This resource is explicitly for the community orgs that need it. I do genuinely believe that opioid settlements, it's a once in a lifetime historic transfer of a huge amount of funds from what is ultimately corporations to governments to try to potentially abate and reduce overdose deaths going into the future. This is a tremendous opportunity for a little bit of wealth rebalancing, I would say. And I think that starts with resources that kind of demystify things that would otherwise be, perhaps too legalese or too in a privileged context to otherwise help those who would need it most. So the community grant tracker page on my website is designed specifically as a wealth rebalancing effort, which is to say, if you know a for-profit org that is interested in opioid settlement grants, but these seem to be doing all right, like maybe, just point them to the guides for community advocates I wrote instead, so they can kind of read up on the spending rules. But this as a shortcut tool, I would only want in the hands of the organizations who kind of live and breathe overdose work, and who might have been doing harm reduction before it was trendy by federal agencies, and back when harm reduction might just have been considered extra charges, so to say, so.
Thank you. Yeah, that's excellent.
Like, what is your best advice, do you feel, for just like us as physicians and other advocates out there in the community, for petitioning for change if you feel like the funds in your state have been misappropriated?
I think the best way to petition for change, I think that requires a predicate step of knowing exactly what a state is or is not required to do with this opioid settlement spend and where the money sits, right? Because sometimes what breaks my heart is when I notice organizations out there who are saying all the right things, and what they're calling for and where they want the monies to go, like that would be efficacious from my non-practitioner's view or whatever, right? Like sometimes I see organizations who are saying all the right things, but they're barking up the wrong tree, right? Like they're complaining about what the legislature has spent the monies on to the advisory board, which might oversee a different share of monies and might not have any say, or legal power to shape how the legislature might be spending the monies, which in other states, the advisory board might have some say or whatever. But anyway, it's a state by state question where the monies sit and where the kind of the balance of power is within the state, right? And I think that any interest in enforcing good spend requires a firm grasp of the intrastate shares within a state, right? Here in Washington, we're splitting the monies 50-50. 50% of the monies are spent by the legislature. The other 50% of the monies are distributed to local governments, right? So that's the ways that states have set up their intrastate shares of funds. And it's creating a diverse portfolio of decision makers and a diverse portfolio of people you can blame if things are going wrong. I mean, that's a strategic aspect of it. But at the very base level, read the community guides that Vital Strategies and I have written for this particular purpose, which is I want to get involved, but what the heck is going on? And how do I speak and move in a way that is itself a veiled threat to the decision makers? Like, I read your statute. Like, do you know your statute? Because I read it. Like, that's the kind of energy that we're trying to impart with these community guides, which kind of gets to my next point, which is so make sure you're barking up the right tree. And the way to do that is to figure out the intra-state allocation of funds. In many states is 50-50. I believe in Utah as well. It's 50-50 state and local.
But that's great, because like these small rural communities, that would be your city council. And that might be your next door neighbor. And you need to go, and that's who you need to be talking to. So that's what people need to know. They need to go to this. You've already put it out on your website. It's already there. Yes. So that's fantastic. So sorry to interrupt, but I think that's really helpful.
No, I'm really glad you said that, because that's kind of the perfect example, which is why make it a bigger deal? Like, sometimes advocacy in this space, sometimes it's more complicated in knowledge is power at all times.
Yeah.
And certainly like in the position of someone who like wants to affect local spend, like they might have thought prior to getting to know where the money sit within a state, they might have thought, well, I need to go to the legislature and can I do that? Like, am I empowered enough? Do I have the time and ability to go and, try to provide public comment or, lobby the legislature, whatever. When in fact, if they're trying to affect local spend, if they were to read up on, the way the monies are allocated within the state, they might come to discover that actually it's my city council, my city or my county is getting the monies directly. And my city or county council has public comment at its meetings. And there, that's like the process of getting involved need not be more complicated than it needs to be. There's a lot of demystification that needed to occur with that as a whole, as you just in general with public health advocacy, right? Like, how is the public allowed to be involved? Like, we shouldn't have to look up statutes to figure out the answer, right? So with that belief, we've created the community guides that describes exactly like where public input is allowed and, where it's not, and are there opportunities for public comment? And importantly, with our updated version of the guides, we go in, we've scanned all the states, but we've also reached out to the state governments themselves. We've given them a chance to chime in when we're saying there are no public input opportunities available for the 30% state share, right? Like, we're giving them a chance to respond and tell us we're wrong. Many states told us, we're just kind of silent when we said like, we found there are no live opportunities for input. Is this true? And not only that, it's not required by the language of your documents. And sometimes they'll just not respond. And we're just going to take that as silence is, just kind of speaking by omission here, I guess. Mm-hmm. But that was kind of a long answer. But I think your example is very apt, because advocacy sometimes can be right next door. But that sounds so cheesy, right? But really, like, exactly.
It really can be. Yeah. Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Is there any topics that we haven't covered that our listeners need to hear?
I think I'll cut it off there, because if
we could keep you all night, and I apologize because I know we're going really long.
It's okay. I think just, I've been accused of being loquacious before. So yeah, I sorry, I tend to ramble, but that means I'm very engaged.
No, I love it. You are fantastic. And I love it because your passion just shows. Yes. And I'm so passionate about this. So I love it. I've learned so much.
I appreciate it.
Yes. But thank you so much, Christine. This has been a fantastic episode. And I just think you have provided so much information and just really demystifying it for us non-legal people, but just explaining that terms and those resources. And for just all of our listeners out there, I just want to put in a huge plug for your website.
All the work you've done, it's incredible.
It really is. Until next time. Hey, check us out at theaddictionfiles.com or email us at theaddictionfiles@gmail.com. Thank you so much to Ricky Valades for use of his song Awake. Check him out at rickyvalades.com.
Podcasts are for entertainment and education purposes only. Hosts and guests are not responsible for any harm caused by information obtained from this source. As each person is unique, you're advised to seek the advice of your own healthcare professional to treat any medical conditions you may be having. Opinions expressed on this show are those of the Addiction Files and not of our respective employers.